Hello and welcome to Cyber Focus, your source for international business information. I'm here with Kevin Thieneman, President of Caterpillar Forest Products and former country manager for China, India, and ASEAN. Kevin, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So you've spent the past 6 years in working in the Asian area with Caterpillar. Can you start by talking a little bit about your personal experience being an executive overseas?
Sure. Well, in total, I've been with Caterpillar for 20 years. 11 of those years was in Asia.
Okay.
So 2 different stints, the first 5 years from 96 to 2001, and then the last stint from the end of 06 until the end of 2012. The last 6 years, the first 4 years was spent based in Singapore, focused primarily on India and Southeast Asia, principally ASEAN.
Mm-hmm.
And then my roles expanded at the end of 2010 to include China in addition. And I physically moved from Singapore to Beijing. So the first part of the assignment, the first 4 years, was largely based on operations.
Mm-hmm.
So we had 2 major factories in India. We were transforming them, mostly from a legacy type of product to more of a modern product, so upgrading the processes and procedures. So that was a big undertaking. And then in the last couple of years was really about improving our execution in China.
Mm-hmm. So you had said that you most recently had been working there for a 6-year stint, but then you had been working in Asia previous to that in a second
Yes.
stint. Had you also worked overseas before that with Caterpillar or with another entity, or was that your first
That was
work
my
overseas?
my first posting was May of 1996, moving from Peoria to Hong Kong.
Peoria to Hong Kong. How did you prepare yourself for that kind of move?
Well, the company has what they call orientation. So someone would come in at that time with some stills, slides of what life is like, showing you pictures of shopping and in housing in Hong Kong. You're in a very small apartment. Our apartment there was just over 1,000 square feet for my wife and me and 2 kids.
That's a little small.
It was kind of tight compared to the house that we were living in Peoria at the time. So someone tries to get you acquainted to what you're going to experience, but it's really more on the personal
Mm-hmm.
side. And then when you get there, it's really you learn by doing. You talk to folks that are there, and not always perhaps the best formula, but it seems to work for most.
And were you prepared for a different working environment? And did you find that the working environment was different there?
Generally, people would say that the work environment in Asia is at a much faster pace. Transformation occurs in a much shorter cycle time. Product cycles typically are shorter,
Mm-hmm.
and the work day tends to stretch pretty long. Not only for the region that you're in, but obviously also working for a multinational company, you're always reporting
Different time zones, yeah.
reporting back to North America, and those late night phone calls to be able to meet in the morning time during the day for the United States.
And what did you have anything in place that helped you cope with these kinds of time differences and possibly cultural differences and then a faster paced environment?
I would say you just sort of get consumed
Yeah.
by, particularly if you're living in Singapore or Hong Kong, which is fast paced generally, and it just it winds your clock. You just seem to pick it up and start to operate at a much faster pace.
What advice do you have for people who are considering accepting a position that would move them abroad if they haven't gone abroad before, particularly in a professional capacity? A lot of people may have traveled, but I think that there's a difference between a vacation and a job.
Right. I think a couple of things are really important. Number one is the cultural piece that can't be overstated. Working in India is very different from working in China than is Thailand or Indonesia or Singapore. So you really need to understand the culture that you're working in. In one country, for example, we brought in an outside consultant to teach assertiveness training
Mm-hmm.
to our local employees, and the reason was we would have them interact with employees outside of that country, and they would basically get steamrolled. We'd have try to make a decision, and they would defer to the folks from outside their home country, and we would talk to them about best of what needs to be done in your country, but it's that cultural deference that some people would take for maybe lack of knowledge or timidness, but it's really kind of a show of deference or respect that would lead to maybe an unhealthy dialogue or discussion. So that part is really important.
Yeah.
The second thing is understand the government and perhaps the corporate structure as well. So say in India, the government does not play a big role in the way business is done. In fact, the common saying is India succeeds in spite of government. The business makes it happen. But there are big family companies there, like Tata, like Mahindra, like Larsen and Toubro, historically family-run businesses that have a huge impact on the economy. So you have to understand that and adapt to that versus, say, China, where there's a lot of state enterprises, where the government does have a pretty large influence in the way business is conducted, business is done, investment decisions are made, approvals are granted. So you have to take that into consideration. Know the landscape in which you're operating. Very important. And I think the other thing is people tend to generalize about Asia, but Japan is very different from China, very different from India, very different from Thailand or Indonesia or Singapore. So you can't broad brush it, and I think that's a common mistake that Americans make.
And that was something I was just thinking as you were talking about generalizations, is that there are a lot of different countries that we're talking about here, and you were managing over several different regions when you were the country manager. How did you handle the differences between these different areas in your one position?
Well, that's a good question. First I had India and ASEAN, and then China came along later. With the team from India and ASEAN, when the change was made, I went to them and I said, well, there's two ways that we can do this. The easiest way for me is I have one staff meeting where everybody calls in, or I have two meetings, one for the South region, one for the North region. And they insisted, unanimous insistence, that it be the latter. They wanted two meetings because they wanted the amount of focus that they felt was required on their region. So, that cultural sensitivity, which there is a lot within the region, impacts those kinds of decisions.
And something else that you mentioned while you were talking about the different countries is adapting. I'm also curious for adapting over time. So Caterpillar has been in these regions for several years, more than several years.
Decades.
How Caterpillar is interacting in these environments changed over time?
I think the biggest difference is the localization of management. We've been in Japan since 1963. We started really in China in 1978. And if you look at our local leader density, it's much higher today. It's at its peak today compared to where we were 5, 10, 15 years ago. So we still have expatriate employees, international service employees, so Americans or Australians working, as an example, working in those regions. But it's really migrated to a point where we want to have Indians managing for India, Chinese managing for China. They understand the cultural, they understand the language, they make better, faster decisions than folks who are not from the culture. You always want to have a blend. It's a question about always finding the right balance, because as a global company, we want our employees, our leaders, to have a global perspective. And the best way to do that is by working outside of your home country. So it's a balance.
And what are the benefits that Caterpillar or another multinational will see from having this blend where you have both your home country, I would say, employees as well as your local country employees working together?
It's diversity. Diversity of thought. You get to a better decision. So everybody brings, you have a more unique suite of skills and experiences that are sitting around a table talking about their perspectives about a particular issue. Perhaps someone from Australia has seen it one way, someone from Europe or the US has seen it another, and someone in China has yet another perspective. And having that dialogue and debate about, will this work, and it has worked here, it won't work there, I think ultimately leads to a better quality decision.
But is that also tricky to manage when you have so many different voices around the table?
Yeah, absolutely. The key is to make sure that you tease out, everyone's ideas, because again, some cultures are reluctant to share their ideas. They want to wait to be asked. They don't want to be seen to have contradicted the boss, per se. So that can be tricky. And in the end, one of the other key challenges is when you get to the decision point and you make a decision, you want to make sure everybody locks arms and leaves the room uniformed in terms of the decision and not constantly going back and trying to challenge the decision that was made, because that slows execution.
What are some of the key business challenges that you think multinationals are facing when they're operating in Asia particularly?
I think the biggest challenge is the GDP growth. And these countries are exponentially higher than, say, what we have here in the U.S. You know, China at 8 to 8.5%, India at 5.5 to 6.5%, Indonesia 6% or so. So they're 3-4 times the pace of growth of the U.S. And so if you look at, let's say, 2009, where it appeared the world economy was imploding, and it was, in many respects. China grew that year. India grew in 2009, as did Indonesia. And so if you took a peanut butter approach to the world, you would have missed opportunities in 3 of the largest economies in the world. And so that part of understanding the on-the-ground reality is critically important.
And it looks like sales growth is actually starting to decline a little, I think in India in particular. Is this more indicative of kind of a follow-up of the global economic issue, or is there something in particular in India that's happening?
You mean GDP growth? Part of it is the slowed process of liberalization. So under Manmohan Singh, when he was finance minister, India undertook a lot of reforms in the early 90s. And that process sort of played itself out over 15 years. But in the last 5 or 10 years, not many reforms occurred to the Indian economy. And so without those reforms, without that liberalization, the pace of growth has slowed. And so that's been the argument of a lot of folks from the private sector as well as the public sector, of saying India needs a new round of reforms, which is what Prime Minister Singh has talked about. So that's the big challenge, I think, for India today, is what are those next rounds of liberalization going to be, and how do you quell or respond to the entrenched interests that get clipped by those changes.
Are there some key reforms that you think would benefit multinationals in particular?
Well, I think multinationals would benefit probably from any range of reforms that happen there. It would be sector by sector, but I think all multinationals would benefit by another round of liberalization, because GDP growth would by its very nature increase, which would ultimately benefit all of the Indian people as well as people who participate in the economy.
Now you've moved back to the States.
That's right.
Have you experienced almost kind of a reverse culture shock as you're moving back to work in the U.S. environment again?
It definitely takes some time to get used to.
What are the differences that you're noticing?
Well, I think, again, that pace. I'm now based in the Atlanta area. Pace of life in Georgia is very different from Singapore or China, as an example. So that takes some getting used to. Living in a house again versus an apartment, a high-rise apartment, is another pretty big change. So those are just a few.
Do you feel like the work environment is relatively consistent? That because you're still with Caterpillar, you feel like you have a similar work environment?
Yes and no. I mean, the cultural issues that you deal with on a day-to-day basis are very similar. The business is obviously different.
Yeah.
And so, when you're in Asia, working exclusively in Asia, the relative pace being faster, let's say, than in North America, it does have it's switch when you come back and you're based in the U.S.
Yeah. So you're a Kelley graduate.
Yes.
Did your experience here at the Kelley School prepare you for your work with Caterpillar and abroad?
Absolutely. I would say many of the skills that I use today, I learned here at IU and subsequent law school on the policy side. And I still use those tools today. I was an accounting major at the business school, and so those are some great tools in the toolbox when you're managing a business, because P&L responsibility, you have to know what levers to pull to either grow the top line and impact the bottom line. So very definitely true. I remember sitting in operations class and organizational theory and thinking, my goodness, why as an accounting major are they making me take these classes? But what's funny is those came back to be put to good use a decade later. When I was operating, being general manager over some production manufacturing operations, as well as doing product development, organizational theory. Really, in any job that you have is really important. Motivating people, even the psychology classes that I took in the liberal arts was important. So it's really interesting. When you graduate, you throw the books away and you think they won't apply, but sure enough, it does come back to be handy.
Did you think when you were an undergraduate that you would be traveling that far for your job? Is that what you imagined for yourself?
No, that's a great question. So my first plane ride was as a senior here in Bloomington, going to Chicago for a job interview. My first plane ride.
How was the job interview?
Well, I got the offer.
There you go.
So that worked out well. And my first passport I got when I was my first year at Caterpillar.
Wow.
So, which was 9 years after I graduated from Indiana. So, it was not an immediate change, but certainly I think the education here definitely paved the road for that later.
Excellent. Of all your time while you were working in Asia, what's one story that really kind of stands out to you?
I would have to say it was during my first stint in China. It would have been, I think, the year 2000, and it was in the wintertime, so October, November. I had a driver, so I'm in the back of the car with a newspaper, reading on the way to work, very early in the morning. And of course, it gets winter, and so brown is everywhere. So something catches my eye, and I look, and the grass is green in the median, which shouldn't be the case in the middle of winter. And so I look again, and I see people with on their knees with paintbrushes and pails of green paint. And I'm thinking, what's going on here? And I look at the paper, and the International Olympic Committee was arriving that day to do the assessment for China's 2008 bid award. So no detail was too small to be checked to make an impression on the IOC. So I thought that was pretty exceptional.
That's amazing that they went to that effort to kind of display such a good side. We're going to paint the grass green.
Paint the town green. Yes.
Kevin, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
That's all for this edition of Cyber Focus. If you have any questions or any suggestions for future interviews, please contact us at ciber@indiana.edu.